Record. We are now live to tape. So good morning once again, everyone, and welcome to the Monday Plenary on Plato. This morning we're going to look at a very important philosopher, arguably the most important philosopher in the West. It was said by Alfred North Whitehead in the earlier part of the last century that the entire history of Western philosophy is, and I quote, 2,000 years of footnotes to Plato. So from that alone, you should know the importance that is placed upon his works. We still read them, and for very good reason. And there's hardly a question that this course won't raise that isn't somewhere in Plato. There's hardly a question that's asked in general in philosophy that is not already raised somewhere in Plato, directly or indirectly. He left dialogues, as you know. He didn't write anything himself, that is to say, in his own voice, supposedly. Rather, he recorded and somewhat dramatized and polished the dialogues between his mentor Socrates and the other interlocutors, of whom he was one, obviously, but he gives his brother Glaucon a voice, he gives his friends a voice. He himself is the author of the dialogues. And we believe that the earlier dialogues are more authentic transcriptions of what Socrates was teaching, and that some of the later dialogues of Plato are tending toward Plato's own voice. So he's using Socrates perhaps as a mouthpiece for articulating his own views of things. But in any case, he's an extremely important philosopher, and this is the first and the only look we're going to take at his work this term. Although one could spend a whole lifetime studying Plato, and we certainly devote an upper level elective solely to Plato's work. And the work at which we're going to look this morning is called The Republic. It's one of his later dialogues and one of his most important as well. It dates back to about 375 BCE, so it's quite old. 2,400 years old, but it contains a lot of relevant ontological and political material. And specifically, the dialogue is devoted, and it's his longest one, devoted to answering one of the questions that's on our agenda, this section of the course, namely the question of justice. Plato sets off to answer that question. Literally, what is justice is the central question taken up. And we're going to look at a small part of it this morning, a very important part, really a core part called the Allegory of the Cave. Maybe some of you have already encountered this allegory in a different context, and if you have, let me know. But we're going to look at it from the context of its original setting, which is an ethical one. Just a housekeeping note before we get launched into that. Next week is spring break. And so my calendar says we have no classes. Are you in agreement with that? That we have no classes all week next week? Does that accord with your own schedules? Yes, good, okay. I know you're happy. I'm happy too. You get a well-deserved break. We're about halfway through, not quite, but we're getting there. So please enjoy your break. And those of you who've, from my section M, are uploading your essays today, and that's fine. I see some of them up already there, and I'll be grading papers. But in any case, we do have next week off. So if you show up, you'll be alone. Don't look for me next Monday. I'll be busy. But I will see you 2 weeks from today, and we'll be examining a more modern philosopher, a contemporary of Descartes, named Thomas Hobbes, who's going to give us a very interesting and controversial view of human nature and ethics. So it'll be very different and opposed to that of both Aristotle and Plato. So let me just recap, and we'll do so, I think, best by sharing this picture again from that painting we looked at last week. Let me share with you the close-up of the painting of the School of Athens, as it's called, or Knowledge of Causes, as it's more properly called. And you will remember, if you can see this, that it's depicting the central panel of Raphael's fresco, in which we see Aristotle and Plato disagreeing about something very fundamental in the nature of ethics, and therefore something basic in their answers to the questions, what is good, what is right, what is just, is going to diverge. As we looked at Aristotle last week, and I think he is the simpler of the two to tackle. His arm is outstretched and he's holding his ethics. That's the book we've already looked at, or at least at excerpts from it. And as you know, Aristotle contends that happiness is a byproduct of the exercise of virtues, which are habits, and that if we are fortunate enough to choose or to adopt or to have impressed upon us good habits and we practice them, then we will be good citizens and good people and we'll be happy. And so your goodness as a person is totally dependent, in Aristotle's view, on your exercise of virtue. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's the contents of your character that will make you good or not, and also at the same time happy or not. And that, in a nutshell, is what we saw of Aristotle. I did mention to you, and I'll bring it up again, because it's very important, I think, to note, to repeat, that there does not appear to be a perfect system of ethics, whether secular or religious. Some systems have many adherents, both secular and religious, but there is no universal consensus on, quote unquote, the best system of ethics. If there were a consensus, as we do often reach on scientific theories, then possibly everybody or most people would subscribe to one system above all others. But this question of ethics is a perennial one. And as we don't have any universal consensus, it's going to lead us to realize that every system proposed is going to have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. So perhaps the answer that you arrive at personally as to which system you wish to subscribe to will be driven, maybe more than anything, by which strengths you consider to be the most important in an ethical system, and perhaps at the same time by which weaknesses you are willing to overlook. And I think that would be fair to say of every system, and certainly of the systems we're going to study. So Aristotle has many strengths, and I think we went over them last week, but in both of my lectures and also hopefully in your breakout lectures. A weakness of virtue ethics that needs to be mentioned, just to recap that much, is that different cultures may indeed form very different conceptions about what a virtue is. So ironically, while we all might agree that we'll be happy if we practice virtues, not everybody's agreed on the list of virtues that we ought to be practicing. And so it can happen, and it does happen, that we have conflicts, cultural conflicts and political conflicts at times, and religious conflicts at times, precisely because of debates that arise over specifically whether a given practice is a virtue or a vice. And this also changes over time within religions and within political systems. So if we look at the US in a secular context, you know that at one time we had prohibition. So drinking alcohol was considered to be a vice. It was not a moral majority, by the way. It was the so-called Temperance League that got that amendment passed by political means. And ironically, temperance means moderation. At that time, about a century ago, the manufacture and sale of alcohol was made illegal. So it was deemed legally to be a vice. You know, that was a reflection of a moral standpoint. Of course, it made criminals rich. Governments are very slow to learn that when they criminalize things that maybe shouldn't be criminalized, they'll end up making criminals rich, which is what happened here with bootleggers. But there are still some cultures which frown on drinking, and there are some cultures which tolerate drinking, but not to excess. So you have different perspectives on the consumption of alcohol. It's not universally a vice, and it's not universally a virtue either. That's just one example. We have medical marijuana now and recreational marijuana being legalized in more and more states. That would be another example of a substance that in some places and sometimes is criminalized, as it still is in federal law. It belongs in federal law in the same part of the criminal code. I mean, you'll locate it, doesn't belong there, but it's located with narcotics. They treat it as the same as heroin, which of course is ludicrous, but that's how it's cataloged, again, owing to very old law. And nowadays we have in states, it's total decriminalization and legalization. So is it a virtue or is it a vice? You know, to smoke pot, that again will depend somewhat on its time and place. And these are more aesthetic things, not really ethical things, but aesthetic things in terms of what we consume. But the same is pretty much true of ethics. And if you want an example of that, one could pick one from the Greeks themselves. Aristotle would have said, and did say, that pride in what one does, that is taking a healthy kind of pride in one's work or one's accomplishments, is fine. It's virtuous to have a certain amount of pride in what you do. If you do something well, then you should take pride in it, and that would be a virtue for you. So think back to Aristotle. If it's a virtue to have a healthy amount of pride, then there must be a vice on either side, right? And we have a word. What do we call it if people have too much pride? You know, the vice of excessive pride. Any suggestions as to what we call that? Suppose you take too much pride in what you do. Any ideas?
Arrogant.
Arrogance, good. Whoever said that? Yes, arrogance, cockiness, narcissism. That's right. Slightly misspelled, but you're saying narcissism, ego. All of that is the idea of taking too much pride in what we do. Correct. The Greeks actually had a word for it, which we have kind of absorbed into English. Do you know this word? I'll type it in. It's the actual word the Greeks used for excessive pride that usually presages self-destruction. They called it hubris. Does anybody know that word? Yeah, Mehraj, you already beat me to the punch. Good for you. Yes, Mehraj, it's hubris. And that's a Greek word, which we now have in English. And it means just that. It means an excess of pride, and it usually will end up being self-destructive. So that's an example. What about on the other side? What would be a deficiency of pride? What would we call that? People who don't have enough pride in what they do. Any ideas? Again, we're used to the excess because we live arguably in a culture of excess. But what about the deficiency? What about people who don't have enough pride? There's a psychological name. Yes, humility would be not so much humility, Denise, which is also a virtue in some cultures. Remember, this is exactly what we're talking about. But it would be a kind of self-abnegation. It would be a self-effacement more than is required, right? So it's not just humility. It's rather more extreme than that. We might call it self-abnegation or self-effacement or whatever Amber's just put up with all those. I'm not sure what the symbols mean, but the psychological equivalent might be low self-esteem, right? People don't take enough pride or have no confidence in themselves, then psychologically it might manifest as that. Renouncement, well, that's a slightly different matter, but renouncement of praise, certainly, or refusal of praise. So all those things would be on the side of the extreme in deficiency. Now, that would be the Greek picture, and Aristotle would say, therefore, a normal, healthy amount of pride is fine and is virtuous. But not every culture believes that. And since one of you mentioned, Denise mentioned the idea of humility, well, in Confucian cultures, humility is a virtue. So if you're in Japan or in China, for example, very strong Confucian cultures, then you would be virtuous if you were humble. And if you were prideful, you would be regarded as being somehow boastful, and that would be a vice. So pride is not publicly shown, but humility is. So there's an example of what, in one culture is a virtue, and another culture could be a vice. And similarly, in the West, we have a contradiction with the ancient Greeks and with Christianity, because if I'm not mistaken, and I know I'm not mistaken, pride is a huge sin, is it not? In Christian cultures, and not only that, in the Abrahamic faiths in general, if we have too much pride, then we appear to be elevating ourselves in the sight of God, and we're supposed to be humble in the sight of God. So that means pride can be a bad thing. And indeed, I think it's and Judaism and Islam both will say this, but Christianity says it, I think, more strongly. And one of the deadly sins, that's exactly right. Pride becomes a huge sin. And so people would have to confess it and try not to be proud. So Aristotle would disagree. He'd say, well, if you think pride is sinful, then you're making a mistake. But clearly we could see, therefore, even though Aristotle is a very important philosopher, by the way, because the same Christian cultures that would tell you that pride is a deadly sin, have also very happily absorbed a lot of the rest of Aristotle's ethics. So it's not a total contradiction. It's just that over time, we end up with these more nuanced positions, okay? So that's one of remember why I'm telling you this is it points to one of the weaknesses of virtue ethics. Not that virtue ethics itself is a bad idea. I rather think it's a good idea. But the problem is coming up with a list of virtues that everybody agrees on. And there we're going to get differences of opinion based on politics, religion, and culture. So we won't be able to come up with one list of virtues. What's a virtue to some may be a vice to others. So even though they agree on virtue ethics, they don't agree on the virtues themselves. Plato's going to give us a different picture and we'll avoid this problem. And Plato's very different. And as you recall and can see from the picture, Aristotle and Plato are pointing in 90-degree different directions, orthogonal, not oppositional. If they were 180 degrees, they'd be oppositional, but they're only 90 degrees apart. And so that's an orthogonal difference. Aristotle is pointing outward because we're embodied beings. And therefore we need to remember what he said, to be virtuous it's an activity of the soul. Happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So we have to act. And so we need to proportion our conduct. A virtuous person for Aristotle is one whose conduct is well proportioned, like the geometric figures from which he derived it. Plato's pointing up. And what is Plato pointing at exactly? I mean, what is this thing? Plato's got his finger pointing upward. Is it not God? Not quite, Denise. He's pointing at something that is his idea of the good. What ultimately is the moral principle that governs everything else. And it is what he calls a pure form. So it's not material. Aristotle is gesticulating into the material world where we find ourselves as embodied beings. And Plato is pointing up at the sky. Well, it's not just the sky, it's beyond earth and beyond sky. Plato is pointing to a realm of pure ideas, which is non-material. So that's why his finger's up. It's the highest form. Goodness is, for Plato, the highest of all other forms. So we have to this morning have a look at that. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to unpack Plato's ontology of the forms. So Plato's ethics really is tied in to his ontology and epistemology, as we'll see momentarily. We can't really discuss Plato's ethics without understanding his ontological commitments. And whether you agree with Plato's theory of the forms or not, and that's, of course, totally up to you to decide, but there's something very beautiful and captivating and charming and poetic, all of those things, about Plato's ethics. So whether you accept his ethics or you disagree with his ethics, of course, up to you. But we're going to look at his theory because it's quite unique in the history of philosophy altogether. And it's encouraging us in a very special way to think about exercising our powers of mind, because Plato is the original rationalist, and he really believes that the pure forms, not just of goodness, but of all things, are ascertainable or apprehensible by the mind, not by the senses. Again, he's the classic rationalist who's going to caution us against evidence of the senses, but this, for Plato, has very strong ethical and political connotations. And they're all discussed in his book, The Republic. It's one of his last books, is certainly his biggest book. And the Allegory of the Cave, at which we're going to look momentarily, is actually a central part of The Republic, book 7. So let's go there. And that gives us a sense of what is this difference, why the 90-degree divergence between Plato and Aristotle. And now we're going to focus on Plato specifically. and we're going to have a look at Book 7. I just want very briefly to share with you the opening paragraph in your text, just to remind you of this important rationalist position that Plato takes. So I'm going to try to find the introduction. There it is. And I'll just share with you again the opening paragraph, hopefully, so that we can be mindful of Plato's very important distinction. Let me look at this and show all windows. So where is it? There it is. Okay, this is the extract in your recommended text. And if you're not using the text, well, his Allegory of the Cave is all over the World Wide Web. You can find many versions of it. In fact, I put a couple of different versions into your Google Drive folders, so you can have a look at those translations. This one is from the actual text itself. It's Book 7 of the Republic, and this extract is quite small, but salient. And in the setup, the editors say the following thing, and I've highlighted it. Plato's distinction between the world we experience through our senses and the intelligible world of forms is the key distinction. If to understand Plato's ethics, we need to go back to this distinction, and that is to say, what we experience through our senses in the everyday world, in everyday life, is not for Plato significant, but where we're going to come to an understanding of what he would call the real nature of goodness and of justice, and therefore where we're going to find the answers to our ethical questions is in the intelligible world of forms. Intelligible meaning intelligible to the mind, because humans have a power of mind that takes us beyond the senses alone. We share the world of the senses with other animals. Other animals do not have ethics, Plato would have said, because they do not have the capacity to apprehend the world of forms. They don't have the same intelligibility of mind as humans do. And so the intelligible world of forms for Plato is more real, actually. Why? Partly because the world of the senses is constantly shifting, constantly changing, and constantly either deluding us or permitting us to delude ourselves, whereas the world of the forms is unchanging. The world of the forms never change. They're outside space and time. Everything within the space-time matrix is indeed subject to change, whether gradual or accelerated. But things in the world of forms, the pure forms, never change. They're outside space and outside time. So once we have access to them, we have access to something that is constant, unchanging, and therefore, in some sense, much more credible than the world of constant flux. So that is very important. And this also, as your introduction says here, tied up with Plato's discussion of who should rule a city, this is going to have profound political implications for Plato. And so profound that what he's going to propose in this overall book of the Republic, the Allegory is Book 7, the actual major dialogue has many books. Those are its parts, right? Book 7 is the Allegory of the Cave, but he's going to propose from this a theory about politics. From his ethics, he'll derive a theory of politics and demonstrate to us what the characters and the conditions of our rulers should look like. And the world has never been able to actualize that. And maybe you'll have some ideas about why momentarily. But first, it's important to take a look at the cave. We got to understand, what does Plato mean by the cave, and why are we in this cave, and how do we get out of this cave, and how do our ethics and our ideas about goodness and rightness and justice, how do they formulate themselves in the cave, and what's wrong with that, and how would they look if we get outside the cave? So that's where we're headed right now. Any questions before we go there? Anything that has come up so far that causes you to question? Have any of you heard of the Allegory of the Cave? Yes, go ahead. Please speak or type. You studied in English. Oh, that's great, Vanessa. I'm really glad that the English professor saw this as a worthy for literature. It also belongs to world literature. It's a very famous part of Plato. So I'm glad to see it came up in English, although it is, of course, philosophy at its core. All right, any other comment or question before we move on to the cave? And you've studied in psychology. That's not surprising, Julia. Not at all surprising, because again, psychology is very much invested with notions of perception and how our perceptions work. And as I mentioned last day, I'm not sure if it was to the plenary group or to my own section M, but we're going back to the 4th century BC. That's long before psychology emerged as a separate science. The first psychology laboratory was opened in Germany in, I think it was 1875. William Wundt was the first person to call himself a psychologist. And so before that, psychology and philosophy were really the same. That is to say, if you were philosophizing about human nature and the human condition, then inevitably you were going to be doing some psychology, right? And so you have the Alan Bloom version. That's great. Bloom was a terrific scholar, and I'm glad you have it. And would it address yes, absolutely, Randy. It's all about education. And you studied him in public speaking. That's not surprising either. So I'm happy as a philosopher to see that Plato has so much prevalence still. And indeed, he is applicable to many other areas aside from philosophy, but he, at his core, of course, he's a philosopher. So let's look at a picture. The Chinese have a saying, a great saying about a picture being worth 1,000 words. So I want to share a picture with you. You will get pictures of the allegory all over the internet. Of course, there are tons of representations of the allegory of the cave in pictorial form. And that's what I want to share with you this morning, just to discuss the cave and what's going on in book 7. It's going to be easier for us, actually, if we look at a picture. So that's what we're going to do now. Let me share the screen again, and we'll pull up this picture of the cave. If you Google this, you'll get lots of pictures. This is as good as any to illustrate what is going on in book 7. And Plato asks us to picture this cave. And at the front of the cave, you see a bunch of prisoners who are chained up. You can't see the chains that well, but they're actually chained to the wall. So they can't move, and they can't even turn around. And all they can do is look in front of them. So what they see are only shadows on the wall. That's all. They don't even see the wall. They don't see what's behind the wall. They don't see the fire. They don't see what's casting the shadows, and they don't see the people who are manipulating the things that are casting the shadows. It's as if they were in this cave from birth, and most of them never leave. So the only reality they know is what appears to them on the cave wall. And of course, these are two-dimensional fuzzy things. The fire moves and dances as it burns, and these images are also therefore fuzzy and shifting. And they may also hear indiscriminate echoes as these people behind the wall are murmuring at them. They will hear echoes of what is being said, also indistinctly, and that will accompany the images. But that's all they know. This is the sum total of their reality, in other words. Now, how many of you in today's world have heard the phrase, perception is reality? Are you familiar with that? It's almost a slogan. You'll hear it repeated all over the place. Yes, some of you are saying yes. And what Plato wants to tell you is absolutely, vehemently not so. Plato wants to say perception is only perception. And in fact, our perceptions are, not only are we not being told and shown what is the sum total of what is real, but our perceptions are being controlled by those who rule us. So they show us only what they want us to see, and they show us only very distorted images at that. So reality, Denise is saying, the prisoners don't fear anything. They just think that reality are the shadows on the wall. And that's all they know. So how could they know anything else? This is all they know. And Plato, if he could come back today, would probably say, or I think he would say, that the only difference between the cave that's depicted here and the contemporary cave is that our cave in today's world comes with a remote. So you could change the channel. So, the cave you're watching, the cave wall you're watching has got maybe 200 channels or maybe 1,000 channels. So your remote can, you could see different sets of shadows. And also you could record. I guess you know how we can now record the shadows that were broadcast last week. In case you missed them, you could get to see the rerun of the shadows from last week or last year. But that's really the only difference. And the media, all of it, whether it's social media in particular, where perception is reality, unfortunately, or whether it's TV, where it's much more subtle at times or very crude as well, pictures and slogans and images. That's what we're meant to digest as the sum total of what's in the world. It's only the cave wall. And so are newspapers, and so is everything else we're exposed to. The purpose of education, says Plato, connected to this earlier question, is actually to get us out of the cave and to start unharnessing the powers of our minds. Remember, for Plato, humans have this great ability, which is to use the power of the mind to overrule and not be swindled by our own perceptions and by the filters that we have in place. And remember, we don't have anything like uniform accounts of what goes on. Perception is mistrusted by all rationalists, and Plato here is making that very strong point, as we saw in section 1 of the course about perceptions as Descartes, who got all this from Plato, not trusting his senses. Our senses will deceive us, and others will use our senses to deceive us. So it's a double-edged sword. 12 eyewitnesses, as you know, give 12 different accounts of what happened. Presumably, your rational mind is telling you that whatever happened in one way. Like, things don't happen in infinite numbers of ways at the same time. Presumably one set of circumstances unfolded. It's just that different eyewitnesses will perceive it differently according to their differing perceptions, and most importantly, the filters that are in place, right? Because we all have our filters in place according to our habits of thought and according to our own biases and predispositions. So we filter things, and therefore we remember them differently because everything's filtered. And so we then give what we deem to be under oath our truthful account, but all these accounts may differ. And that's because our memories differ, and that our memories are based on our filtered perceptions. So that's for Plato a big problem, because we want to get at the reality in order to understand, quote unquote, the truth about what happened. We need not to depend strictly on perception. And in Plato's more overarching purpose in this book, he wants us to understand the truth about goodness and about justice, which for him is the most difficult truth. Easier to do mathematics. We're all going to get agreement much more readily on geometry and even on aesthetics, thinks Plato, on art. He thinks we'll agree more readily about those matters than we will about the political and the ethical. He says those are the most difficult. And that's where his theory of forms comes in, okay? So in the meantime, you can see the suspicion that's being cast upon what the prisoners are seeing. It's not their fault. They don't know anything else. And says Plato, we're all in the same boat to begin with. So the evening news wants us to perceive a certain version of events. So what's being reported to us, the way the film's being edited, the way the pictures are being photoshopped, the way the script is being contrived, the way the narrative is being formed. That's all to cast a certain set of shadows on the wall and to make us believe a certain version of events. But it's not reality and it's not truth. Okay? And I hope you appreciate that is just as, I think, sustainable today as an account of what most people come to believe. It's just that the technologies have changed. So instead of the fire being used to cast shadows, we have much more high-tech ways, but therefore more seductive and more, in some sense, more dangerous ways, just because the technology is a lot better. We have special effects. We have all kinds of ways of convincing people that perception is reality. And Plato just wants you to be very, very cautious about that notion. And in fact, to suspect that most of the time perception is not reality at all. Okay? It's a very powerful message already. I hope you see the power of this allegory. So what would happen, says Plato, or asks Plato, what do you suppose would happen if somebody got free and could turn around and actually see what was going on in the cave? Well, obviously, firstly, they'd be blinded by the fire, right? Because their eyes are accustomed to a darker sector of the cave. And the reflected fire, the firelight on the wall is much dimmer. So in the first instance, if you stood up and turned around, you'd actually be blinded initially. And you would therefore have to adjust to the light, which you would, but it would take you time. And now Rachel's question, would the puppet masters be the top 1% of the world? Yes, exactly, Rachel. They're the ruling elites. And they're keeping us, partly hypnotized, partly mesmerized, partly brainwashed, partly indoctrinated. They are more and more feeding us a narrative that is completely manufactured by them and not entirely for our benefit. Exactly, like the media. That's all part of it. That's what Plato would tell you, for sure. The puppet masters are rulers. They're the elites. And they're the ones who are in charge of what we see. And if you put something up on YouTube that they don't want other people to see, they will take it down, right? Google will take it down, won't they? If you say something on Twitter that other people, that the rulers don't want other people to hear, they will take it down. They might even cancel you if you keep doing it. If you write a book that the rulers don't want people to be reading, they'll cancel the contract, and so forth. This is happening as we speak. And so I think that this allegory, unfortunately, in a way, has even more traction today than it has had at other times. Although Plato would say it's always like this, just a question of degree. Yes, Vanessa, it's like the restricted books and policies and all of this. So, Mirage, what if I escape and live in a jungle? Well, there's another problem, because if you really want to unhook yourself from the matrix, right? If you want to get off, get off the radar totally, it's much harder. You could move to some. There are small communities now. There's something called the Simplicity Movement. Maybe some of you have heard of it. The Simplicity Movement is trying to get away from all of the technological controls and get back to the land. But that's more and more difficult nowadays. It's more and more difficult to live without email. You can hardly do any transactions anymore without computers intervening, and therefore without your data, one way or another, being tracked and stored. So it's very difficult. Amazon won't deliver it to you if you're living in a shack in the woods. You're going to have an internet connection to avail yourself, maybe even of certain essentials. So you can get off the grid, but it's certainly not easy. It's like those Alaskan bush people. If you do get off the grid, then you'll be spending 99% of your time in survival mode. And that's very rewarding for some, but I don't think most of us could manage. So we pay the price, okay? And it's not about leaving society, Randy and Vanessa and others. It's not about, or Mehraj, it's not about leaving society. It's about leaving the cave. It's about seeing the world for what it is, not for what it appears to be, okay? So Plato's not saying get out of the cave in terms of get out of society. He's saying use the powers of your mind to understand the forms, to apprehend the true nature of existence, and therefore also of ethics. So he's not saying get out of the cave. He's saying, this is an allegory, right? He's saying, free yourselves from what's being imposed on you by others. Free yourselves from the narrative. Free yourselves from the perception. And that we can do sitting in our chairs at home if we contemplate well, says Plato. Okay? So we get eventually, we turn around and we see the fire, and we realize these objects are actually three-dimensional, and they come in different colors, and they're not just black and white fuzzy shadows, right? Or gray fuzzy shadows, they're actual objects. But then eventually, when our eyes get used to this, we may actually see that there's a way out of the cave itself. And as you see some of the prisoners who've released themselves or escaped, they find a way out of the cave. And now they come into the light of day. And so they're totally blinded at first. I mean, if the fire was relatively blinding compared to being chained up to the wall, then imagine what happens when you get out of the cave and you're in the bright illumination of daylight. You'll be even more blinded and more perplexed. But eventually you will also adjust, says Plato. Of course you'll adjust. And then you'll notice something very interesting. Well, Randy has a question. How does Plato think perception and the mind are... Well, again, the forms, Randy, just let me try and explain this to you. I'm trying to take some time to do it. The forms are ideas. They're not things. So the connection is that perception is only things. What we perceive are only things in the world, one way or another. But what we conceive, the ideas that we're able to conceive, are not material things for Plato. And the pure forms, which I'll explain in a moment, are not material at all. And so the power of the mind is the power to apprehend, which is the verb Plato uses, to capture, if you like, to understand, if you like, the nature of the world of forms. And it's a non-material world, and it's an unchanging world. And it also contains a kind of perfection, which the material world does not. And that's the difference, okay? That is a big difference between our perceptions and our conceptions. And Melissa's saying you discussed this in art history. Great. Of course you would have, because Plato's influence on art history is also monumental. The Italian Renaissance to begin with, and onward. So it's all part of the same theory. And I'm glad you've learned this in other contexts. But now we're going to touch the core philosophically of what he's saying. And that should also illuminate, for you, those of you who've been exposed to this, it will also hopefully shed even more light on why you've been studying this in these other contexts. So when you get out of the cave, says Plato, you're going to have eventually, once you acclimatize, you're going to have a big realization. And the realization is going to be as follows: that everything in the world, whether it's fabricated by us as human beings or whether it's made by nature, stars and planets, or whatever nature makes, or animals, whatever comes out of nature, or indeed whatever humans fabricate with our technologies. All of these things, said Plato, each and every thing is a copy of its respective pure form. So this is Plato's belief that all things that we actually use or make or observe, each type of thing is a copy, and therefore an imperfect copy of something called its pure form. So to give you an illustration from the natural world, we see stars, planets, moons, right? And they're all spherical, are they not? Roughly spherical. And Plato would say, yes, they're roughly spherical, but none of them is a perfect sphere, obviously, for various reasons. If they're planets or stars, they're orbiting, and their poles are therefore slightly flattened because of the forces of rotation, and etc. So they're not perfect spheres, but they're approximate spheres. And they're all copies of the pure form of a sphere. And we can actually write that down. That's one of the few forms we actually know how to write down. I could write the equation for you. If I can just say it aloud, some of you who've studied math know the equation of a sphere. It's x squared plus y squared plus z squared equals r squared, right? or is it Z? What's the American? We say Z or Z in this country. I'm bilingual, so I always forget. I think we say Z. Right. Okay. So X, Y, Z. So X squared plus Y squared plus Z squared, that's equal to R squared. That's the equation that describes what? The perfect sphere, right? And here's the thing, you can all picture it. Every one of us can use our minds to picture what a perfect sphere would look like. Isn't it not so? Just concentrate for a moment and picture a perfect sphere. You can all do this. That's one of the easiest forms to grasp. But the problem comes when we try and make one, because nature can't. Again, the stars and the planets, they're spherical, but they're not perfect. And what about the spheres we make and we use spheres all the time. Examples, what kinds of examples are there? The world abounds with spheres. What do we use spheres for? Any suggestions? We have spheres all over the place that we've made. Typically what? Anybody? How about sports? We have all kinds of spheres that we use in sports. Thank you very much. Yeah, balls, every ball, whether it's a basketball or a baseball. A football is a little different. It's not a sphere, it's a copy of a different form. But baseballs and basketballs and volleyballs and beach balls and ping pong balls and tennis balls, and maybe I've left some out, but all those objects that we play with and have a lot of fun playing with and play professionally, they're all copies. A ring is not a sphere, Denise. Yeah, a ring is a circle. Okay, so we're talking about 3D balls now, and all those different balls that we manufacture are spherical, obviously, but they're still not perfect, correct? They're not perfect spheres. Are you with me? They all have flaws of one kind or another. A baseball has stitching on the side. A basketball and a beach ball has a nozzle, has to be pumped up with air, so it has to have a nozzle, meaning it's not perfect either. The surface is therefore deformed in a certain way, and on and on. So none of them are perfect. But Plato says they're all copies of the perfect sphere. So they're copies of the pure form, and the pure form is not perceived with any of the senses. The pure form is perceived with the mind. That's the power of mind. So now I want to start to move very quickly for you to understand that where Plato is going with this is that if everything we make a copy of is a copy of the pure form, then it would follow for Plato that the person who's making this thing, the person who's fabricating this thing, Plato says if they have a better grasp of the pure form, then they're going to be able to make a better copy. So Plato would say, if you're sitting in a chair, then if the chair is comfortable, it means whoever made that chair has a better grasp of the pure form of a chair. If the chair is really uncomfortable, then whoever made that chair doesn't really have a grasp of the pure form of a chair. They have a much unclearer grasp of it. So the closer we get to apprehending the pure form with our minds, the better able we are to make more authentic copies of it, although no copy will be perfect. All right, you're beginning to see where he goes with this now? So it's the same with goodness and justice, exactly the same. Therefore, if you want to do good deeds, Plato says, you need to apprehend the pure form of goodness. And if you don't get it very clearly, then maybe your deeds will not be very clearly good, or it's partly good, but not always good. But if you really apprehend the pure form of goodness, then in fact, you're going to do really good deeds. And same with justice. So if you're a legislator, now immediately you see the political implications of the same theory. If you're making laws, says Plato, if you have not glimpsed the pure form of justice, then the laws you make have very small chance of being just. The only way that a law could be just, says Plato, is if the lawmakers themselves have grasped in some clear way the pure form of justice. And if they have, then their laws are definitely going to be more just than the laws of those who have not. So this is very interesting, and that's how his ethics flows really from his ontology. Because remember, the pure forms are never going to change. The pure forms are always going to be what they are, and therefore for every generation, goodness and justice will have the same meaning. If they're grasped properly as pure forms, then good people and good deeds and just people in a just society will also have the same forms. I mean, will have the same copies, better or worse, of those forms. And that, in a nutshell, is the book of the Republic, and it's meant to explain how this works, and therefore how the people who rule us need to be taught themselves how to get out of the cave and grasp the forms. And the conditions of the ruling class are spelled out by Plato. It's amazing his view of how they should be educated and so forth. It's quite shocking, and I'll summarize it for you in a moment. But first, and that's all in the Republic, it's not a secret. But there's one thing also we need to understand. Are you okay so far with this? That if you grasp the pure form of something, then you'll be able to make a better copy of it than perhaps someone who has not grasped it clearly or at all. And this is how it works, okay? And for everything. And nature, Plato says, works the same way. And moreover, that's how we know. For example, we have a lot of different species out there. And you can think, for example, about all the different dogs in the world. Like, dogs vary hugely in shape and size, right? If we think about dogs, they vary from Great Danes to toy poodles and all species in between, right? All these different dogs in different shapes and sizes. But Plato would say they all have something in common. And why he says that is, if you imagine that you saw a different species of dog for the first time, a different breed of dog, right? Like you saw this dog, you had no idea what breed of dog it was, but you would still know that it's a dog, wouldn't you? And Plato would say that's because all dogs are copies of the pure form of a dog. And so in our minds, we already have some conception of the pure form of a dog, so we recognize a dog when we see one. And if people who think dogs are very beautiful, if one, breed of dog appears to you to be much more aesthetically beautiful than another dog, Plato would say probably it might be the case that that dog is a better copy of the pure form of a dog, whatever that might look like. So dogs that win dog shows are, in their particular class or category, they're better copies of the pure form of that kind of a dog. And that's Plato's view. I mean, nobody writes about this because we don't philosophize about dog shows. But if we did, that's how his theory would apply. But it also applies to beauty. Remember, ethics and aesthetics are related. So this is the key thing. And the other component of this contribution, which may be difficult for some of you to grasp. So I'm going to try and explain it because it's really important for understanding how this actually works. Because you may well already be asking, if you remember back to our discussion of dualism, if the pure forms of things are insubstantial, immaterial, outside space and time, and all the copies are material things in the world, how do they interact? Like, what's the connection between the pure form and the materialization? And Plato's answer is that there's a third thing that enables the connection to be established. And that third thing is called essence. I'm going to type it in. Because essence is the thing that links the pure forms to their material copies. And that's why Plato's philosophy is sometimes called essentialism. Because Plato believes that essence precedes existence. This is really important ontologically, because if everything is a copy of a pure form, then material existence has to be all things that are copied of pure forms, and therefore have to contain essences, right? They have to contain essences. And the essence, therefore, has to come before the existence. It's the only way anything could exist, is if the essence of the pure form flows into it. This is a very interesting ontology. Now, you're not going to find essence in a laboratory. You're not going to find essence in a in the in the periodical table of elements. No one's ever seen an essence because it's not material. But by the same token, it's not purely ideational either, because the essence is the thing that connects the form to the copy. So the essence is a kind of a commuter. The essence is the connector. So Plato would say, for example, if you see a sculpture and you say, oh, that's such a beautiful sculpture, Plato would say the reason why you perceive it as a beautiful sculpture is because it contains the essence of beauty. Because the sculptor was able to perceive the pure form of beauty and therefore make a really good copy of it. And in so doing, the essence of beauty flowed into that sculpture. And so it's full of the essence of beauty. And that is the thing that connects the forms to the copies. It's called essence. It's a very mysterious thing, but it's necessary in Plato's ontology. And we would say the same about a good deed. Why is a good deed good? Because Plato would say it contains the essence of goodness. So if you do a good deed, Plato would say, you did this partly because you perceived the pure form of goodness, and that allowed the essence of goodness to flow from the immaterial realm into the material realm of your deed. And therefore, your deed contains the essence of goodness. And that's how other people recognize it also as good, because they recognize the essence of goodness. And the same with justice. If you make just laws or if you act justly in society, Plato would say the same. It's because you have perceived the pure form of justice to a certain degree, and therefore the essence of justice has been able to flow through you into the laws you crafted or into the way in which you act. And so people will say, well, that's a just person, or that's a just law because it contains the essence of justice. So this is the role that essence plays in Plato's philosophy. I'm not saying it's clear what essence is. It's a bit mysterious, but that's what it is. Is that all right with you? Are you able at least to get a handle on this, how it is that the immaterial realm of the forms is connected to the material realm of copies of them? They're connected by essence. It's very important to understand in Plato. It's got nothing to do with Aristotle. Now you can also see why Plato and Aristotle disagreed about ethics, because Aristotle didn't believe in essences. Okay so far? So if that's okay so far, I want to go even further. I want to go even further with you. So here's another way in which Plato and Aristotle disagreed fundamentally. And it's as follows. Remember, Aristotle said that goodness or badness is going to be basically a byproduct of virtues and vices, respectively, right? So if you acquire the habits of a virtuous person, you'll be good and also happy. If you acquire the habits of a vicious person, then you'll be bad and also unhappy. That's not Plato's view at all, because Plato's ethics are not symmetric. Plato's ethics are as follows. And some of you may have thought this. Nobody asked yet, but maybe some of you already wondered. Please tell me if you have. Is there a pure form of evil? Right? Is there a pure form of, isn't that fair to ask, Plato? Well, wait a minute. If you're upholding a pure form of goodness, is there a pure form of evil? And Plato would say no. Plato would never accorded in his ontology or his ethics equivalent status to evil. It's not like the Hollywood struggle between good and evil, Star Wars, right? May the force be with you. It's not like the philosophy of the ancient world, Zoroastrianism, where they saw a huge cosmic struggle between good and evil. It's not like Taoism and Chinese philosophy, where you have yin and yang, where you have a balance between good and evil. It's not like that. For Plato, the good exists, and evil is only a falling away from the good. So in other words, people who do bad things, right? Cruel things, mean things, harmful things, evil things. Plato would not say they're evil. He never said they're evil. He got this from his teacher Socrates. He said they're ignorant of the good. So this is a very different view. And Plato is actually saying that everybody is born with the capacity to apprehend the pure form of goodness. That everybody is born with virtue inside us. But philosophy, he says, is like the midwife that allows us to give birth to our own virtue, and also that allows us to apprehend, therefore, the pure forms of all the virtues. And so Plato, in a certain sense, is a great optimist, because he's not saying there are evil people. He's saying there are ignorant people. And it's, again, people who basically either through lack of education or through lack of awareness and a contemplation, or for lack of getting out of the cave, have never been exposed to the idea that they actually have virtue inside them and need to be awakened. And that was Plato's view of the philosopher in a very important dialogue called Theaetetus. I'll spell it out if you want to read it. It's a short one. Plato says that the philosopher is only a midwife. The philosopher does not give you virtue or sell you virtue. The philosopher is only a midwife to the birth of your own virtue, just as women in those days, of course, midwives helped with all births, and no midwife ever said, I gave this baby to the woman. It's not like the stork brought it. Like the woman was pregnant, and the midwife assisted her in the birth of her own offspring. And Plato said, we're all pregnant with virtues. We're all pregnant with wisdom. Every one of you, says Plato, is pregnant with wisdom. But you need the philosopher as a midwife to help you give birth to your own wisdom, which is very compelling, I think, very, very enlightening and very egalitarian doctrine. And this is 375 BC, came up with this. Pretty amazing. So isn't evil and ignorance of the good as good as ignorance of the bad? No, Denise, not in Plato. No. Evil is ignorance of the good. Okay? Good is not ignorance of the bad. Because Plato would say, and Plato did say, it's very important question. Plato would say that if you caught a glimpse of the pure form of goodness or the pure form of justice, you would never be able to act in any other way other than with goodness and with justice. Because evil in you would be eradicated. There's no evil in you. It's ignorance of what's good. And if you catch a glimpse of the pure form of good, you will be filled with the essence of goodness, and therefore what you think and what you say and what you do will reflect the essence of goodness, and your acts and your speech and your thought will be copies of the pure form of goodness, and therefore you will not be a bad person. Impossible for you to be a bad person. And some of you, I hope, are seeing that Plato, almost 400 years before the birth of Jesus, of course, Christianity didn't happen for almost 4 centuries later, but I hope you're beginning to see a major connection between Plato and Christianity. Because if you think now about the formative idea of Christianity, I hope there's something that's occurred to you about something that is absolutely critical to Christianity that came straight out of Plato. Although Plato didn't invent Christianity, he never knew about it, he never could have foreseen it. But there's something very, very important for you to understand. If we talk about the pure form, I'm going to type this in. Pure form, which then, for Plato, gives rise to the essence, right? Which then gives rise to the copy. Does anybody see a connection there with anything that's fundamental to Christian metaphysics? Is any of you seeing this? Nobody seeing this yet? I'll type it in. What connects in the Trinity? What do we have? Yes, the Holy Spirit. That's the essence. Exactly right. Exactly right. This is the Christian mantra, right? The Trinity. The God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it's the Holy Spirit that connects them, yeah? The Son is a copy, right? If you look at it, if Plato could come back, he'd say, oh, sure, you have God, the pure form, and then you have the Son of God, which is the copy of God on earth, the embodied material form, right? But but conceived by the Holy Spirit. That's the essence that connects the divine to the mundane. So the Trinity is based on Plato. And that's why one reason why Plato has such a strong effect in Christian cultures and why Plato has been taken up by Christian cultures. It all originates with him, not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but the idea of this triumvirate, the pure form, the copy, and the essence that connects them. I hope this is an important revelation for some of you, especially those of you who may have been brought up with Christian theology, to understand that important connection. And also to understand, if you read the most influential Christian theologians, they're all Platonists. If you read St. Augustine, who is one of the major theologians from the 4th century AD, and Augustine repeats Plato. If you read, for example, City of God, Augustine says, and I'm paraphrasing this, that evil is a falling away from the good. He's repeating Plato. He's saying evil is not something that exists in its own right. He said when people become evil, it's because they have fallen away from the good. They've allowed themselves to become distanced from the good. It's not that evil has a power of its own. And if you think about it in demonology and eschatology, who's the devil? Who's Lucifer? He's a fallen angel. Yes, Renee, bingo. The angel that fell from heaven. So it's not that there's this separate, equal, and opposite power to God, whom we call Satan, right? Or Lucifer, or the devil. No, the devil's a fallen angel. That's Plato. The angel has fallen from goodness, has fallen away from God, and therefore became evil. But that evil is not a pure existing thing. There's no pure form of evil. There's only a lack of awareness, of understanding of the pure form of good. So it's an ethic which is monopolar. It's not bipolar. Plato's ethic is monopolar. Yes. So people doing bad things, well, for good reasons, is misunderstanding, Randy. It is misunderstanding. Or doing good things for bad. You know, you could do the right thing for the wrong reason, right? You could do the wrong thing for the right reason, or the wrong thing for the wrong reason. And that all would be, for Plato, one or another kind of misunderstanding. Exactly right. Okay. So you see the connection now? Now Plato raises another issue. Suppose you got out of the cave. And this is in the same book. Suppose you get out of the cave, and you suddenly had this incredible revelation about the pure forms and all this stuff. So wouldn't you want to come back and tell the others? I mean, you see, remember, you've left this whole society of people. They're all chained up to the cave wall, you know, and they're all watching CNN at night. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist saying that. Anyway, they're all watching, you know, whatever station they watch. Could be Fox, whatever. Okay, they're watching TV. They're all back in the cave. And you want to come back into the cave and liberate them, right? So you come back to the cave. Suppose you come back into the cave and you start to explain to them all this stuff that you've realized outside the cave about the pure form and about the sunlight, and which, by the way, is goodness. In Plato's Allegory, the sun outside the cave is the pure form of the good. And Plato says it illuminates all the other pure forms, all of them. So the good is the sun that illuminates everything else. Suppose you came back into the cave and told everybody about this. What would their reaction be? What do you suppose these people who are still chained up to the cave wall, what might their reaction be to you? That would be on a good day. They certainly would not believe you, Vanessa. They would think you were crazy, Emily. Exactly right. That's what Plato says. They would think you were out of your mind. They would think you were insane. And what else might they do to you? Well, Plato says what they would do. They said they'd probably kill you because you're too much contradicting their impression of reality. They would attack you. Exactly right, Alexandra. They would attack you for being different, and you are a heretic. They'd call you a heretic. They'd call you a madman or a madwoman. They'd call you insane, and they might even put you to death, says Plato. And when he says that, he is alluding to Socrates, because that's exactly what they did to Socrates. So now I hope you begin to see that Plato's experience with this great mentor who was put to death in Athens on trumped up charges. They accused him of corrupting the youth. He was trying to get everybody out of the cave. He was discussing these very issues with them. trying to get people to think more clearly and more beautifully. And they put Socrates to death. So that's part of Plato's message. And I just want to conclude today. We have a few minutes left. This is at least to give you a picture of the context of his ethics and what his ethics are. And now you see how they differ so much from Aristotle as well. One more thing about the rulers. Plato would agree with Aristotle that we need to have a balanced soul, and his three parts of the soul are not that different from Aristotle's. And Plato also thought that a just state will be a state whose parts of society are balanced. Just like each individual, you balance your instinctive, that is your appetitive part, with your emotional part, with your rational part. Those are the three parts of the soul for Plato. If we bring them in balance, then we also will be just. And for the just state, it's the same thing. The people who produce, like the farmers and the artisans and the people who produce things, have to be put in balance with the military that protects the state, and also has to be put in balance with the rulers. And as far as the rulers are concerned, Plato's guardians, they were called. This will amaze you if you read more about the Republic, or read the Republic where he talks about the guardians. These people are not elected. They are trained to be rulers. They need to understand what it means to be a ruler. And one of the things about the guardians is the ruling class in Plato's utopia, if you like, they own no property. They have political power, but they are never allowed to use that power to enrich themselves. They're not allowed to own anything, which is totally amazing, right? I mean, that's never happened. But that's Plato's idea. They would never be corrupted because they would never be able to use their political power to gain personal wealth, or to be bribed, or to be lobbied, or to be corrupted in any other way. So of course, they have a roof over their heads and they have food, but they're not allowed to own property, and they're not even allowed to, therefore, give property to their children. And their children are not raised by them. They don't want their children to be corrupted by them either. So they're a guardian class. And it may amaze you even more, back in 375 BC, that Plato said that men and women could be guardians. He didn't say it's men only. He said men and women, both, have the capacity to be guardians. So Plato was the first feminist. Technically, he's the first one on record to say that women and men can both have political power. 375 BC, only slightly ahead of his time, right? And the condition, again, is, though, that they have not to be corruptible. They have to be able, as he put it, to wrestle naked in the gymnasium and not be overcome by sexual desire, because they have to be not corrupted by instinct either. So Plato's rulers are nothing like our rulers, because they don't own any property to start with. Needless to say, we've never tried this, right? I know of no country in the world which has ever tried Plato's model, but Plato said that would be a just society. If we balance individual souls and get people out of the cave, understand the pure forms, and have the society in balance the way the individual souls are, then we will have a really great kind of utopian way. That's never been tried. And you might want to contemplate it, okay? I mean, it's never happened. Why? Ask yourselves this. Why has it never been tried? We've tried every other form of government, but I don't know any rulers who'd be willing to relinquish their personal wealth in order to have political power. Interesting, right? Okay, any last questions? I mean, this sets up, at least I've given you an introduction to this very important theory of ethics from Plato and how it's tied into his ontology and his epistemology. Okay, any questions or comments? I can't quite hear you. If it's Remo, I don't hear you at all. Sorry. I see you, but I don't hear you. Maybe you could type. Who's a rebel, Denise? You are, if you get out of the cave, but not really. Not really, or not a rebel in terms of being seditious or in terms of being an insurrectionist. You're actually working for the good of others. And if you think about it, in human history, we have lost a lot of very good people through assassinations because they've tried to do exactly this. If you think about people like Dr. King in the States or Gandhi in India, They were like this. They were not personally wealthy. They were very powerful, and they were trying to bring more justice into their society. I'm sure Plato would say they had glimpsed the pure forms, and they tried to get people out of the cave. But when you try and do this, you're definitely going to make enemies. Okay, definitely. Yeah, Randy, you're touching on an important point, that disagreements about beauty. Plato would say, and this is where some people are horrified by Plato. I'm not saying everyone loves Plato either, that Plato's theory of aesthetics is exactly going to give rise to this kind of contention. Because remember, Plato would say, if that sculpture really has the essence of beauty in it, then if you have glimpsed the pure form of beauty, you will see it and you will agree that the sculpture is beautiful. If you think the sculpture is not beautiful, or if you think it's ugly, if it really is beautiful, Plato would say, it's because you haven't glimpsed the pure form of beauty. So, in other words, Plato's theory of art is not at all subjective. In fact, it's objective, right? He's saying that if a book is good, it's because it contains the essence of good literature. If a sculpture is beautiful, it contains the essence of beauty itself. And so that's an objective theory of art. And of course, a lot of people think that, whatever they like is fine for them. That's a relative theory of aesthetics. And so they will disagree with Plato for sure. Any other comments or questions? Well, I will send your email eventually, Ellen. You don't have to worry about email. I do respond to email. I've been responding 12 a.m., 11:59 p.m., Jake. Okay, 12 a.m. will be Tuesday morning. This is due Monday night. For my group, see, now you're going to confuse everybody. Only my section M has work due today. And so please don't confuse everybody. This is a plenary. This is multiple sections in the room with, multiple instructors who are assigning their own work. So please don't confuse everybody, Jake. Your essay in my group is due tonight. Okay? But don't worry about it. Well, I answer emails, and maybe some professors don't, or maybe some professors are more negligent. I can't speak to that. Most of my colleagues in the department I know to be responsible, and I always answer emails from students. It may take me a few hours or even a day, but I do answer all my emails. Don't worry about that, okay? So to wrap up, we're going to meet on Thursday with my group, and you'll have your own breakout groups meeting this week. Undoubtedly, you'll continue Plato. I have more to say about Plato and more to say about the Republic, definitely, and we'll discuss that on Thursday. No, you can't ask me now tomorrow. The time to ask me is email me before class, okay? Or after class, you can stick around for a minute. I will stop the recording momentarily and stay in the room. If you can ask me then. But really the time is to, better not to use class time for this, but to, ask me in my office hour. But I'll hang around for a minute. So once again, next week, you have spring break, and I wish you a very happy one and a safe one. I will see you all in this plenary in 2 weeks' time when we will look at Thomas Hobbes, and that reading is in your Google Drive folders. It's not in your textbook. Very important modern philosopher. His view of human nature is extremely interesting and highly disputed. He disagrees, needless to say, with both Plato and Aristotle. So the reading in 2 weeks' time is, I'm going to type his name in. It's in your syllabus. In your syllabus, if you're in any doubt. And it's also, the reading itself is in your Google Drive folder, okay? With 2 B's, okay? Hobbes with 2 B's. That's in 2 weeks. And so I wish you a very safe and happy spring break. Those of you in Section M who have questions, I'll stay in the room for a couple of minutes and answer them, but I will stop the recording of this lecture on Plato.